All right, so the next step that we're going to take in our application, we've already created the basics of most of the important pages in our app, such as the note detail page, which displays the details of the notes and allows us to edit them, and the notes page, which displays lists of notes. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is make it so that instead of just displaying static data, right, our notes page and note detail page currently just display static data from inside our routes.js file. What we're going to do is make it so that these components can actually make changes to this data and do things like create notes, delete notes, and update notes as well. Now, there's a few ways we could go about this. One way to do it would be to add a useState hook to our routes component and have these notes be expressed as a state variable, and then we would just basically pass those notes down to all of the components that needed them. Now, this would allow all of our different pages to share that data, since again, that data would be contained up here in routes. So, whenever we changed pages, each new page would have access to the same data as all of the other pages. However, a slightly better course of action, in my opinion, would be to use context, right? Because just to review what context does exactly in a React app, context basically allows us to, instead of having our component tree look like this with the app component, in this case, we have our routes component like this, and having the rest of our components down here, right? One page, another page, etc. Without context, what we would have to do, as I said, is we would have to have the state contained in our routes component and passed down as props to all of our pages, right? And our pages would also then have to accept props which would allow them to modify that state, right? Functions essentially from inside routes that would allow them to modify those things. With context, however, what our components can do is basically have something that's outside of the normal component tree that they can share data through, right? So this is a normal component tree right here. If we have context over here on the side, right, we'll have some kind of context. Our components can actually access the state of this using the useContext hook, as we saw. Right? So in other words, their parent component doesn't have to store and manage that state for them. So what we're going to do here is we're going to use context to manage all of the notes for our application, and this will allow us to do things like delete notes, add notes, modify notes, etc. Okay? So that's our plan. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a notes context. So first of all, what I like to do is usually create a new folder that I keep my contexts in called contexts. And inside here, we're going to create a new file which we'll call notes context.js. Okay, now remember that in React, the way that we create a new context is by simply using the create context function. So we're going to say import create context from React. And then we're going to say export const notes context equals create context, and we'll just call that with no value passed to it. All right, and remember that the way that we use this context is something like this. Inside a very high-level component, such as our app component or our routes component, I'll just use our app component for demonstration here. The way that we allow our components to access that context is by saying import notes context from contexts/notes context. And we actually have to wrap all of the components that we want to have access to the current value of that context inside what's called a provider of that context. So the way that we do that, we just say notes context.provider and wrap all of the components that we want to have access to that context value inside of that. Okay, so in this case, everything inside routes, including routes itself, would now be able to access the value, which we can pass as a prop here of this context. Right, so if we were to say value and do the string hello, this would allow all of the components inside of here to access this value using the useContext hook, right? This is something that we saw when we first learned about context in React. So that's the basic syntax and strategy for doing that, but what I usually like to do, and this is something that we saw in the friend tracker application as well, If you haven't seen that, I'd recommend you go back and take a look at that. What I usually like to do is create a separate component that will actually encapsulate all of the logic for the context and take care of storing its data, right? Because when the data inside a context can change, that means that we have to involve a use state hook. We have to create our own functions, which will take care of managing the state in that use state hook, etc. You'll see what I mean in just a second if you're not familiar with this. So essentially what we're going to do is I'm going to create a new folder, which I'll call providers. Okay, and this is going to contain special components that encapsulate the logic for our contexts. Now, in reality, you probably could just put the different components that I'm going to create inside of here inside the contexts, but why not keep things more separated? It's always much easier to combine things if we find that there's not really any use in that division than separating things after the fact. So let's create a new file inside providers, and this is going to be called notesprovider.js. And what this is going to do, we're going to start off by importing the notes context up here. And I need to change the quotation marks there. For some reason, my IDE is set up to use double quotes instead of single quotes. And we're going to say export const notes provider. And what this component is going to do is take all of the children that we put in between its JSX tags, right? So in other words, we're going to display this like notes provider and have a bunch of stuff inside of here, right? What we're going to do is use the children prop in React, which we've seen earlier, to make the context available to all of the components inside the JSX tags, as I said. So what this is going to look like, we're going to first of all say return, and we're going to use the notes context.provider, which I showed you earlier. So notes context.provider. And inside here, we're just going to display all of the child components in between the JSX tags using the curly braces and the children prop. All right, so the next thing we need to do is pass the value prop to this context that all of the children components will be able to access. And again, because we want this to be able to change, we're going to need to use a state variable for this. So let's start off here by importing the use state hook from React. And we're going to create a state variable called notes here and set notes. And the initial value for that is going to be the fake notes thing that we had inside our routes. What I'm going to do is actually remove those from here. Well, for now, I'll just copy and paste them, but we will be removing this shortly. We're going to paste it inside our notes provider, and this will be the starting value for our notes. Okay, so we'll say use state, starting value is going to be fake notes, and that's our state variable. Now, in order to make these notes available to all of the components inside this provider, we're going to just say value, and we're going to pass an object as this value, which will say notes. Okay, so the way that components are going to actually access this is going to be something like this. I'm just going to type it out here, but they'll say something like const notes equals use context, and then they'll have to say notes context like that. That's what it'll look like essentially. So that's why this notes thing is inside an object, because we're going to want to also pass other functions and other data management things like, for example, if we want to allow a component to delete a note, we'll allow them to have access to a function like this, which will have to pass through the value from inside this notes provider. You'll see what I mean if you're not familiar with that shortly. But the next thing we're going to do is, now that we have this notes provider, we're just going to allow our components to access it. The first thing we're going to have to do for that is we're going to have to import our notes provider component into our app component by saying import notes provider from providers notes provider. And we're going to wrap all of the components in our application inside this notes provider by saying notes provider and putting our routes, which contains all of the components so far for our application inside of there. All right, so that should allow our components to access that context. So let's go into our page components, which are currently accepting notes as a prop. Okay, so if we take a look at these things here, notes, fake notes, we're actually going to delete that prop and have our page components access the notes directly through context. So I'm going to delete this fake notes thing up here as well. And then let's just open up our notes page and note detail pages. Notes page, note detail page. Oops, there we go. and we're going to have them access their notes through context. Now, the first step in this, as you may recall, is by using the useContext hook, right? We're importing that from React. And then we're going to remove the notes prop and instead say const notes equals useContext. And for that, we have to actually import the notes context as well. So we can say import notes context from ... contexts / notes context. Okay, and then we just have to pass that context as an argument to our useContext hook. We'll say notes context, and that's all we need to do. So the same thing now is going to apply to our note detail page. So we'll do the same exact thing. We're just going to say import useContext from React, import our notes context from its file. Okay, and I'll put that down there. There we go. And we're going to remove the notes prop here and replace that with context. So we'll say const notes equals useContext notes context. And that should be it. So everything now should work just as before if we did everything right. Let's try this by running it. We're going to say npm run start, and we should see the exact same functionality that we had before in our app, except that all of this logic, right, all of the notes data is encapsulated inside a context provider. So let's actually just go to notes here for now. Oops, just notes is what I want. There we go. And sure enough, we'll see that our notes are displayed just like before. We have my notes shared with me. And if we click on view, that'll take us to the note detail page. If we click on edit, right, everything is working exactly the same way as it was before, except, as I've already said, it's using context behind the scenes. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.